Chapter 27. Return to UK and Singapore revisited. We were not due to fly out to Singapore until early March, but, in the meantime I was to be attached to Headquarters Coastal Command at Northwood in Middlesex. Firstly, I had a few days leave, after disembarking at Southampton following the sea voyage from Gibraltar. We drove to St Ives in Huntingdon, where the Covisons had kindly offered to put us up until we left for Singapore. Thus we continued the arrangement we, as close families, had previously enjoyed. It was always an ideal setup, for while staying together we always shared the total costs of running the house. By this method both families gained financially. In addition, Peter Cowison, myself, Glenys and Jean always got on so well together, sharing lots of happy times. Christmas was getting fairly close, so we planned for the festive season ahead. I had to report to HQCC and would live in the very comfortable mess at Northwood during the week, and each weekend I drove up to St Ives, which was just a comfortable 2-hour drive. My duties at Northwood were not onerous and I had lots of time free. I did various planning tasks, formal inquiries and also helped the personnel staff. This was appropriate since I was going to a personnel staff post in Singapore. Visits were made to Air Ministry to the personnel staff there in order to brief me on the situation I would meet in HQ Far East Air Force. In the event I enjoyed my stay at Northwood, aided by the mild winter which allowed me to play golf regularly at the famous Moore Park golf course. Since the HQ mess had a block membership the cost to play was very cheap. The chap I was working with, like me, was a keen soccer fan, so we went to a number of big evening matches in London. I knew the area of Northwood very well because of the many previous times I had stayed nearby, when the Cowisons were stationed there. It was also not very far from where my family had lived until my mother and father passed away. Christmas came and went and our time to leave for Singapore edged closer. Just before leaving we went to Carnarvon to see Gladys' sister and spend some time looking around the North Wales scenery, an area so dear to my heart. Early in February, we left St Ives and went to stay for the last couple of days with my sister and her husband at Hampton Village near Hampton Court. The home was only half an hour's drive to London Airport from where we would be leaving. I had quite a bit of leave due to me, so we were going to visit New Zealand, before I took up my appointment in Singapore. The service paid to fly us out as far as Singapore and then I paid our fares to New Zealand, where we were able to spend a month's leave. It was planned that Gladys would stay on with Valerie at Sean's R.A.A.F base at Woodburn near Blenheim, in the far north of the South Island. I was to fly up to Singapore when I was due to report, then Gladys would fly up later when I had been allocated a married quarter. It was high summer when we arrived in New Zealand, having spent 2 days in Singapore before flying to Blenheim. During our stay at Changi we met up again with our old friends, the Bradburys, who were doing another tour in Singapore. This meant we would have close friends there when we took up our post at HQFEAF. We flew BOAC to Sydney and Air New Zealand from Sydney to Wellington and then took the short 20-minute National Airways Corporation DC-3 flight from Wellington, across the Cook Strait to Blenheim. It was an emotional reunion with Valerie and Sean, especially for Gladys, who had not seen them since their wedding in Gibraltar. Valerie was now expecting another baby due to be born in July. My month's leave passed too quickly, but, whilst in New Zealand we did a trip to Palmerston North to meet Sean's parents. We also went to Hawke's Bay and spent a week with Jock and Phil McHardy on their big sheep station at Waipukurau. Jock was Sam McHardy's brother and the McHardy family are a quite noted family in the area, having been amongst the first settlers in this wonderful farming country. Whilst there I went on an early morning sheep muster to round up several thousand sheep. To begin the muster we went along the beach. From the homestead we then had to scale a steep cliff a couple of 100 feet high. Jock wondered if I was going to take on the cliff, but I did, remembering his sound advice, not to look down when climbing up the cliff face. It was a marvelous introduction to a hill country farmer's life. Following the muster I joined in a day separating the sheep into classes and then a day sheep dipping. Finally, we went to Lake Taupo for a weekend at the McHardy's bungalow in the township of Taupo. We returned to Blenheim to spend the rest of my leave, before I departed for Singapore. I had very fortunately been able to get a flight on an RNZ-A.F DC-6 aircraft flying to Singapore, and to catch the flight I had to fly to Auckland to the RNZ-A.F base at Wainuipe. Just north of the city, I had a day at the base, where I was entertained by Wing Commander Derek Flintoff, who had been the Kiwi on my staff college course and was now commanding No. 5 Squadron. RNZ-A.F flying Sunderland flying boats. He gave me a tour of Auckland City and its surrounds, which gave me a good look and an idea of what this great city has to offer. I did not know at the time just how much of my future would lie with the City of Sails. The next day I set off on the very comfortable DC-6 flight to Singapore. Firstly, we flew to Brisbane and had a night stop there. There were a number of Kiwi Army and Air Force officers on the flight, so we all trooped into Brisbane for the remainder of the day. The next day we flew on to Darwin and had another night there. I had always enjoyed my visits to this city, because it is so different from other parts of Australia, with its tropical fauna and flora, quite a contrast to the many desert-like areas of Aussie. The next day was the last leg on to Singapore, where Keith Bradbury met me and took me up to the Ferry Point officers' mess, where I was to stay until Gladys joined me. The headquarters mess had quite a history, going back to the days when it was a British Army gunner's mess, before the war. It was beautifully appointed on a hill overlooking the Straits of Johor. Also, it was only a short walk down to the officers' club. The mess was very comfortable and I had a lovely room looking out over the straits. The food was excellent and the mess staff superb. In this convivial atmosphere I soon made a number of friends and settled in quite happily. My boss, the senior personnel staff officer, was Group Captain Bud Lewin, whom I had known in Germany, when he commanded the communications squadron at R.A.A.F Buckberg in 1951. Bud was a marvelous person and had a lovely wife Jean, and they both made me feel most welcome. I shall never forget their kindness to me over the early days of my tour, but, sadly, they are both no longer with us, having both died of cancer some years ago. Bud took me around to meet the chaps I would be working with and also arranged for me to meet the Air Commander, Air Marshal Sir Rochford Hughes. He was one of so many New Zealanders who had joined the R.A.A.F before the war. Carrying on to have such distinguished careers in the R.A.A.F with my New Zealand connections, I immediately got on well with him. The HQ was, as when I served there previously, containing a mixture of R.A.A.F, R.A.A.F and RNZ-A.F staff filling the various posts. One of them was Wing Commander Nixon, an Aussie with whom both he and his wife I had been with on 218 Squadron in Bomber Command in 1944. There is no doubt, the Air Force is a small world with so much fun meeting up with friends of many years association. I was able to collect my Worsley car from Singapore docks. It had been shown that it was quite cheap to ship the car from UK to Singapore, a choice I took advantage of, so it was good to have my old car with me again. Firstly, I had to get to grips with my duties, which I found very interesting. It is always absorbing to be dealing with people, and personnel staff is totally involved in that aspect of service life. After a couple weeks of settling into the job, it was time to go round the command. Far East Air Force was a very big command covering a huge area of the Far East, Australia and India. However, firstly I needed to visit the bases on Singapore Island, namely, Seletar, Tengah and of course the units at Changi itself. Changi had 205 Squadron Shackletons on maritime reconnaissance, but, mainly, it housed the FEAF transport wing with Hercules, Argosies, Andovers and the RNZ-A.F 41 Squadron Bristol freighters. Tengah was a fighter base, with Javelins and Lightnings. Seletar was primarily a maintenance and supply base for the whole command, but with helicopter squadrons and some technical transport aircraft. R.A.A.F Butterworth in northern Malaya had Aussie fighter squadrons equipped with Mirage aircraft. Hong Kong had only a few transport and helicopter aircraft, plus the Hong Kong Auxiliary Squadron. Frequent detachments were provided from Singapore for the Hong Kong's defense needs, which were flying into R.A.A.F Kai Tak, which was also Hong Kong International. R.A.A.F Gan in the Maldive Islands was far off from Singapore, but still a vital link in the chain of bases from UK to the Far East. I soon got around to visiting all these places, familiar to me from my previous tour of Changi 7 years earlier. It was great to be back in the Tiger City and I soon felt as if I had come home. Of course great changes have taken place in the island's development, with Lee Kuan Yew having now established himself as a world leader, after 9 eventful years as Prime Minister. The extraordinary development of Singapore had raced along, including high-rise buildings which had shot up all over the island. Many of the native villages, kampongs, had been bulldozed to make way for multi-story apartments. Huge supermarket complexes had sprung up everywhere. Whereas air conditioning was quite rare on our first tour, it is now commonplace, with cars, offices, homes and many other places were mostly air-conditioned. Whilst the changes were in many ways comfortable, it seemed that Singapore as we had known it, had changed dramatically, with much of its old charm having disappeared. It was, of course, still a great port and a prime tourist destination. Our shopping haven of Changi remained much the same and the shops were as before. The shopkeepers, renowned for their long memories, immediately recognized me and greeted me warmly, even remembering Gladys and Valerie. Recreation was soon looked after. I immediately joined the Changi Golf Club. It had been intended that Gladys would stay in New Zealand until Valerie's baby was born. Unfortunately, Gladys' health had taken a bad turn and the doctors in New Zealand had recommended that she come to Singapore for treatment and also to be near me. She flew to Paya Lebar Airport and I could see straight away that she was a sick person. I arranged for her to be seen by the R.A.F doctors and specialists and she was admitted to an army hospital in Singapore, where they specialized in her complaint. After a few worrying weeks, she seemed to recover and was moved to Changi R.A.F hospital. The first diagnosis had not been strictly correct and they felt that it would be best for her to be in Changi. The correct diagnosis was finally made, proving to be a serious liver disorder. Soon the treatment for this worked and Gladys was able to leave the hospital, giving us the chance to move into temporary accommodation at an officer's family hostel and then into a married quarter. A bungalow right on the main camp and a couple of 100 yards from the golf course, overlooking the Johor Straits. It was a prime setup and we soon settled in very well. We also got a first-class armor, R.A.A.F, who was a Chinese girl of Hokkien descent, young and very hard-working. Gladys got on with her very well straight away, for R.A.A.F was a remarkable girl, with a keen mind and a wonderful memory. Gladys would show her how to make a particular recipe. Although she could only speak a limited amount of English and could not write the language, R.A.A.F would memorize the details with amazing accuracy. After having been shown once, next time she would say, "Mem me do," then proceed to do the dish on her own with very little extra help. Things were stirring in the headquarters as the air commander was having trouble with his personal staff officers, both with his ADC and his PSO, personnel staff officer. Already he had got rid of a couple of these chaps and was looking for someone to sort it all out. But Lewin spoke to me on the problem and told me that the air marshal kept on mentioning my name. Eventually, it was put to me that I had to change my post from DSPSO and move up to the Air Commander's office in the post of Head of Secretariat. In this post, which had been changed from its original intention, I would have a special responsibility to supervise and train new personal staff for the Air Commander. I felt that I was possibly going to be some sort of sacrificial lamb, or the fall guy. However, I figured that as I was really no longer in the promotion stakes, what had I to lose? The Air Officer IC Administration, a plain-speaking Rhodesian, Air Commodore Highland Smith, interviewed me and told me the move would be good for my career, should I do it well. I did not enlighten him that I intended this is to be my last appointment in the R.A.F. I really only agreed, not because of his suggestion as to my future, but because of my own private agenda. At the time of my move to the Air Commander's staff, we also had a new Chief of Staff, Air Vice Marshal Peter Lekeminant. He was a brilliant staff officer, with an outstanding reputation as a service writer, who had won a number of essay prizes. Each year there are competitions held for the best papers on specified service subjects, for example air warfare strategy, defense policy and the like. Lekeminant had won a number of these. I had first met him when he was on the Lancaster course at Kinloss in 1948, when he was a squadron leader. Later he was to rise to Air Chief Marshal and be Vice Chief of Air Staff. I found that I could work well with him and help as a go-between with his relationship with the Air Commander. 4 Air Commodores and senior civil servant of equal rank reported direct to the Chief of Staff. My duties included acting as secretary to the Chief of Staff's committee on which these Air Commodores and the civil servant served. Each morning a meeting of these officers took place with the Chief of Staff. Their appointments were the Senior Air Staff Officer, Air Commodore Stan Quill, a New Zealand Air Force officer, Air Commodore Highland Smith, Air Officer IC Administration. Air Commodore Peter Cleaver, the Senior Technical Staff Officer, Air Commodore Edgar Bright, Principal Medical Officer, and Mr. Michael Stewart, the Command Secretary, the aforementioned civil servant. I was, therefore, as a wing commander, in a very privileged position, and one in which I was privy to an awful lot of information other officers of my rank and below were not. This status of mine required considerable tact and discretion and a need to keep a lot to myself. I also found that I could be helpful in smothering relations all round, and very soon I found that people trusted me with confidences. In this way I was able to help other staff officers of junior and senior rank to me. A word of advice could save an officer falling foul of the Air Commander provided he was prepared to listen and realize that I was helping him, which most didn't benefited from it. Air Marshal Hughes demanded a high standard, and after a while we got the right people on his personnel staff, which meant that I had less to do for him. He still regarded me as his senior personnel staff officer and as such, to be regularly taken into his confidence. My job in the HQ became one of considerable interest and accorded me a position of prestige. When the Air Commander went away on major visits I was often asked to accompany him. He was a great one for getting around his command stations and squadrons, obtaining first-hand information on what the men at the sharp end were thinking. Often when his staff made some comment on policy for the units under command, he would say, "Have you talked to them and been to see them?" "Well, I have, and this is what I think." It was always a convincing way of getting his point over. The first of these visits I went on was a historic and fascinating one. In December 1967, the Air Commander was invited to carry out an official visit to Indonesia. It was to be the first such visit since the end of what had been called confrontation. The battle with Indonesia over occupation of British Borneo. Sir Rochford Hughes was the first senior British commander to make a visit to Indonesia following the hostilities. We left on the 18th of September in a VIP-fitted Andover transport aircraft to fly to the Indonesian capital, Jakarta. Apart from Sir Rochford and Lady Hughes there was only the ADC Flight Lieutenant Tim Wood, and Tim was an excellent officer from the Royal Air Force Regiment with a fine bearing and manner and a great sense of humor. The visit had been arranged with the Indonesian authorities by Group Captain Ken Charnley, the R.A.A.F. Air Attaché in Jakarta. The Andover was captained by Flight Lieutenant Shraples. There was a certain tension over the visit, because, after all, we were visiting a country which had virtually been at war with Britain, over the Borneo territories. We were not sure how we would be received, but the Air Attaché had sent a brief for the Air Commander indicating that we were likely to receive a very friendly welcome. After a 2.5-hour flight we arrived at Jakarta's International Airport and were met on the military side of the airport. There was a long lineup of senior Indonesian Air Force officers and their wives to greet the Air Marshal and Lady Hughes. As they stepped down from the aircraft, and the greeting was very warm and friendly. Here we also met Group Captain Charnley, who did the introductions, speaking in Indonesian when necessary, which was of great help. However, apart from the wives, most of the Indonesian officers spoke English. Many of whom have been trained in USA and UK. From the airport we travelled with a police-escorted motorcade into the city and, in particular, to the Ministry of Defence. Here the Air Commander met the Minister of Defence and Air Force Commander Air Chief Marshal Rosman Nurjadin. He was a fine-looking man with a ready smile, and he greeted the Air Marshal most warmly. This really broke the ice, and from here on in it was all goodwill and smiles. Indonesia, after confrontation, had been through a traumatic period. There had been a communist attempt at a coup, which had failed, but not before a number of senior officers and politicians had been murdered. There followed a period of absolute savage butchery, during which we learned about 400,000 people had been slaughtered. After the coup failed, General Suharto had eventually taken over the presidency. For many years previously, The country had been ruled by the despotic President Sukarno, who had driven out the Dutch at the end of World War II. The country was very much under a military dictatorship, with each province controlled by a military governor, most of whom had been involved in the ruthless suppression after the coup. They were men holding immense power in the area under their control. The first evening was very much a social one with a reception and dinner at the Indonesia Air Chief Marshal's residence. The British ambassador was present, as the British government had never actually broken off diplomatic relations with Indonesia. Although the embassy and its staff had experienced a dreadful time during the confrontation. The embassy itself had been attacked and the staff virtually held under siege at one time. Group Captain Charlie had been in Jakarta throughout and had been through some harrowing experiences. Fortunately, all was well now and relations with the Indonesians at all levels had been restored to its former friendly atmosphere. At the reception we met senior Indonesian officers of all services, politicians and other senior government officials. Also present were diplomatic staffs of the USA and Commonwealth embassies, mostly air and military attaches. The following day we spent the morning making courtesy calls on all Indonesian service chiefs, traveling impressively by motorcade in a siren-sounding entourage from place to place. The afternoon was free and the Air Marshal and Lady Hughes had a game of tennis at the American ambassador's residence. Ken Charlie arranged for me to play golf with him at the Jakarta Golf Club. This was to be quite an experience, for all round the course were troops with machine guns. The Indonesian hierarchy were all keen golfers and on the course that afternoon were President Suharto, whom I met in the clubhouse, plus all the senior officers we had called on earlier. The contingent of troops deployed around the course were for the VIP's protection. That evening we attended a reception at the British Embassy to which all the senior Indonesian officers and their wives we had met earlier were present, plus various other diplomats and their ladies. The Wednesday morning was an early start, to go by R.A.A.F. Iroquois helicopter to fly to the Indonesian Air Force, R.A.A.F, base, at Ngsemkaka, close to Jakarta. This proved a most informative and interesting visit, as the R.A.A.F had been equipped by the Russians with a substantial number of aircraft, especially MiG fighters. These were all lined up for us to see, consisting of one's MiG-19, 5's MiG-17s and one's MiG-21. On closer inspection they all seemed a bit run down and I noticed the tires all had almost bare treads. We were told that since the attempted communist coup was put down, the supplies of arms and spares from Russia had ceased. Of all the aircraft on display only about 5 out of the R.A.A.F total of 16 MiGs were serviceable. One very impressive aircraft was a huge Russian helicopter which could carry up to 60 troops in which a parachute troop drop was laid on for our benefit. We were able to sit in the MiG cockpits before we left the base for a final farewell call on Air Marshal Rosman. He told us that from now we would be escorted by Air Commodore Suwarto, the air commander of the East Java region in whose area centered on Yogyakarta, we were now to visit. The Air Commodore was a very pleasant man who spoke good English. After the final call on Rosman we went to Jakarta Airport where the endeavor was to fly us to Yogyakarta. On arrival we were free the rest of the day apart from a very interesting visit to the famous temple at Borobudur near Mendat, outside Yogyakarta. A temple which was for years lost in the jungle until rediscovered by Sir Stamford Raffles when he governed the area. This was the famous Raffles, the so-called father of Singapore. The temple was a fantastic feat of building, when one realized how all the materials had to be dragged to the area and the site hacked out of the jungle. It is a similar sort of sight to behold, as Angkor Wat in Cambodia. That evening we had dinner in the hotel accompanied by Air Commodore Suwarto. On the Wednesday there was an official visit to the R.A.A.F Academy at Adisat Jipo Air Force Base. Here the Air Marshal got the full VIP treatment with a full guard of honor and a large pipe and drum band. One was struck by the American influence with all the cadets dressed in USAF style battle dress and helmets with blue neck scarves. There followed a drill display, after which we toured the academy, in the quite impressive college buildings. The R.A.A.F had a history of mixed American and Russian trained men. Quietly, we were told that the ones trained in Russia had received quite a bit of a political indoctrination whilst there, which the R.A.A.F had to counter once they got back home. The remainder of our tour was pure relaxation. From the Air Force Academy we flew in the Andover to Tuban Airport in Bali, where we were to stay 2 nights at the famous Bali Beach Hotel. Bali was still largely unspoiled in 1967, before the tourists really started to flood in. The hotel, superbly appointed by the beach, was one of 70 or more luxury hotels in the intercontinental chain. It was quite luxurious and we wallowed in it all. In the afternoon we went into the nearby town to witness a huge religious parade. Later on we went to see a display of Indonesian dancing in a temple ruin which was fascinating, but went on rather too long. The evening was fabulous with a full tropical feast by the pool, together with all the trimmings. After the meal we were treated to a performance of the unique monkey dance, a feature of Indonesian culture. This was followed by the beautiful graceful Balinese girls doing their renowned dancing repertoire. On our final day we called on the military governor, a huge roly-poly individual, whom I wouldn't have wanted to cross. His staff were in complete awe of him and never took their eyes off him. Bali had witnessed much of the worst of the communist coup massacres, along with Java, but it was hard to imagine what such an apparently peaceful place like Bali had been like in the coup days. After our call on the governor we were free to see more of the sights of Bali and to swim at the hotel. One especially interesting visit, later that day, was to travel to the former residence of President Sukarno, at Tampax Sering, in the hills of Bali. It was a beautiful spot and so much cooler than the coastal area. It was here that Sukarno enjoyed the company of his many girlfriends, for which he was renowned. There was no doubt that he could charm any lady, Indonesian, European or otherwise, would he choose to do so. In Jakarta is a huge plinth which Sukarno had constructed in his memory. It became known in his declining years as Sukarno's last erection. The time spent in Bali came to a close all too soon, and as we flew back to Singapore we dwelt on the 2 wonderful days in this island paradise. The visit had been a great success and a credit to Air Marshal Sir Rochford and Lady Hughes, who had played their parts so well. It did nothing but good for the re-establishing of good relations with Indonesia. For me personally it had been an unforgettable experience. My first few months sorting out the Air Commander's staff, plus my worries over Gladys' health, had been quite a strain. Fortunately, the Air Marshal was off to UK for a conference and I was not going with him. This gave me the chance to take some leave, so we drove up to the Cameron Highlands and stayed at the famous hotel of that name. It was lovely to enjoy the warm days and cool nights, which was so much better to sleep in than Singapore's heat. We enjoyed relaxing on the golf course and taking local scenic visits to the tea plantations and jungle areas. The flora and fauna are quite unique in this beautiful area of Malaya. En route we stayed in Malacca and Kuala Lumpur at the excellent government rest houses. After this holiday we were both suitably rested and refreshed. Further visits with the Air Commander followed. The Air Commander and Lady Hughes went on a 3-day visit to Hong Kong and I accompanied them. We flew up to Hong Kong in a Hercules aircraft and back in a Transport Command Comet. There had been riots in Hong Kong and the colony was going through troubled times. There was also some discontent amongst the R.A.A.F personnel over family housing. We toured all the Air Force establishments, of which were highly secret, being engaged in intelligence gathering as to what was happening in China. We also toured the whole border with China by helicopter to see the police and British Army at work. Much of their work was to stem the flow of illegal immigrants from China, who always had been a problem and, in fact, are still today. Lady Hughes met a number of the wives and discussed their housing problems with them. I was pleased to have a good look at Hong Kong again and also do some shopping, always a worthwhile pastime in this mecca of the shopping world. In February 1968, Gladys and I were invited to travel by VIP Andover to Australia and New Zealand with the Air Marshal and Lady Hughes. The first and last part of the trip was for the Air Commander to make official calls on the New Zealand and Australian Air Force chiefs. In between he was taking a couple of weeks leave, which we could also take to visit Valerie, who now had given us a granddaughter and we were dying to see her. Sir Rochford was nearing the end of his time in the R.A.A.F and was looking to his future back in his homeland of New Zealand. Once again we flew in the Andover with Flight Lieutenant Shraples and crew, traveling via Bali for a night stop once more at the Bali Beach Hotel, which I thought was a good move by Sir Rochford. We arrived at lunchtime, so we had the afternoon relaxing again in the hotel pool and surrounds. I had told Gladys what a fabulous place it was and she was not disappointed. The plan was to fly from Bali to Darwin, night stop there, and then fly to Townsville and thence to Auckland. When we got to Darwin R.A.A.F base, the base commander advised the air marshal that there was a very active tropical storm over the Townsville area, and that a change of route was advisable. It was agreed that we would fly to Alice Springs, to stop the night, and then on to the R.A.A.F base at Laverton, Melbourne. From there we would fly to Hobart, Tasmania, stop the night and then fly to Christchurch. It was a large, but interesting change of plans, for we got to see Alice and Tasmania, two places we would not normally have visited. After a short 1-hour tour of Darwin, whilst the Andover crew replanned the route and hotel arrangements ahead made, we took off for Alice Springs. We arrived at Alice in rough wet conditions, the first rain for 7 years. The locals welcomed us, telling us we could come again if we bought rain, a rare thing in Alice. Later that evening the weather cleared enough for us to take a walk around the town. Next day we had 2 sectors to fly, to Melbourne and Hobart. The weather had cleared and we had a good flight into Laverton, where the temperature was 35 degrees Celsius. It was lunchtime and the tarmac area was like an oven. Fortunately, the base commander had arranged for us to have a drink and sandwiches in an air-conditioned room. The flight to Hobart was only 1 hour 40 minutes, as it was clear we got a good chance to see the Tasmanian scenery en route. We took a scenic drive around Hobart on arrival. It was Sir Rockford's birthday, so we had a celebration dinner in a rather pleasant hotel we stayed in, followed by a rather good cabaret act by an Aussie country singer, who sang all the traditional songs. It was very convivial evening. Next day the flight to Christchurch took just over 3.5 hours. At last we were back in New Zealand again and looked forward to seeing Valerie and our new granddaughter. Sir Rochford had business in Wellington, but, with typical kindness, he offered to fly into Woodburn and drop Gladys there. I would be able to join her later, after accompanying the Air Marshal on his official business in Wellington. The arrival of the Andover caused a great deal of interest in New Zealand. Firstly, because it was one of the first of its type to be seen in the country. Secondly, Mount Cook Airlines were to receive their first Hawker Siddeley 748, the civilian version of the Andover, in the next few months. We stayed long enough for Harry Wigley, the managing director of Mount Cook Airlines, and some of the staff to look the aircraft over. At Woodburn, the air commander was at the controls and did the landing, and the whole base turned out to see the aircraft, which later on the RNZAF were also to get. I got out with Gladys and was greeted by the base commander, Wing Commander Alan Wood. Whilst he went into the aircraft to meet the Rochford, I had time to greet Valerie and Sean and for a few minutes hold my granddaughter. After leaving Gladys with Valerie and Sean, we flew the short trip to Wellington, via the Marlborough Sounds, which at low level is a wonderful sight. On arrival at Wellington we were met by the Hawker Siddeley manager and his staff, who had arranged for a presentation of the aircraft to New Zealand government ministers and officials. The Minister of Civil Aviation Mr. Gordon, the then Minister of Finance, Mr. Muldoon, were present and afterwards were given a flight in the aircraft. During our stay in Wellington, Sir Rochford was to meet the 3 service chiefs of the New Zealand Defence Forces. He was also having a meeting with the Minister of Civil Aviation, who had been at the aircraft presentation. Group Captain Roy Auric was the air advisor and he had arranged the program. I had known him at Celle in Germany when he was a squadron leader, commanding the 94 Squadron. We stayed in a very comfortable motor lodge near the airport. On our first day in the capital, the Air Marshal had a meeting with the 3 service chiefs of the Army, Navy and Air Force. After the initial greetings the meeting got underway, but their staff officers left the office. Sir Rochford, I think to their surprise, said that he wished for me to stay for the meeting. That was his way, and to them he obviously showed the confidence and trust with which he held me. It also served a good purpose for him, because, always after such meetings both in Singapore and elsewhere, he would go over with me what had been discussed so that nothing was missed. That evening we had dinner with Air Marshal Sir Alex and Lady McKee, at Roy Auric's residence. I had, of course, served under Square McKee when he was a senior air staff officer at HQ Bomber Command. Lady McKee was a distinguished concert violinist in her own right. Once our stay in Wellington was over, I flew into Blenheim to enjoy my 2 weeks leave with the family. Prior to this visit, the R.A.F. had announced a redundancy scheme, to which I had applied and had been accepted. I now knew I was only a few months of leaving the R.A.F. and coming to live in New Zealand. A friend of mine from UK who visited Singapore had been on the redundancy board. He told me that the R.A.F. had very reluctantly agreed to my request to leave the service. That was a nice feeling to at least know I was still a valued member of the R.A.F. However, with the future settled, we were able to discuss our plans for coming to New Zealand with Valerie and Sean, which made the visit to New Zealand all the more worthwhile. 1968 was to continue to be an eventful year in many ways. For the R.A.F. it was a significant year as it recorded the 50th anniversary since its formation as a separate service on the 1st of April, 1918. Celebrations were going on in all the areas the R.A.F. served, and the Far East Air Force did not lag behind. There was a formal dinner at the headquarters mess at Ferry Point, at which the guest of honor and main speaker was the Singapore Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. With his superb mastery of the English language, he gave a most appropriate and excellent speech. This was one of many memorable dinners I enjoyed during my years involved as personal staff to Air Commander, and previously to Lord Selkirk. Over the years I had dined with all the leading diplomats, politicians and business leaders in Singapore. Commanders from all the R.A.A.F. units, plus Commonwealth and overseas diplomats in Singapore, and attended many glittering occasions. Various other parades and ceremonies were held to mark the 50th celebrations throughout the year. It was no longer compulsory for staff officers to keep their hand in at flying whilst doing tours of duty on the staff. Consequently, no aircraft were held on establishment for this previous requirement. I overcome this with the help of other staff officer who was doing some flying instruction at the Royal Singapore Flying Club, based at the International Airport at Paya Lebar. He introduced me to the club and I became an honorary instructor. Although we were not paid, we did the instruction on a voluntary basis. We were allowed a few Singapore dollars expenses each time we flew. I enjoyed this diversion very much, for it enabled me to get a Singapore pilot's license and gave me regular civil flying. The club had single-engine Cessna trainers, Piper Cubs and a de Havilland Chipmunk which was fully aerobatic. This flying was to prove of importance to me later on. In addition to the flying club, we joined the famous Singapore Cricket Club, who had played their cricket on the padang in the heart of Singapore for many, many years. Apart from the cricket, the club had an excellent restaurant, which Gladys and I went to regularly. Once again, as in my first tour of Singapore, it was to be a significant link with Lord Mountbatten and his family. One day the Air Commander received a signal from the Chief of Air Staff, asking the Air Marshal if a plaque could be presented to the St. John's Ambulance Brigade in Kota Kinabalu in Borneo, on behalf of Lord Mountbatten and his family. This plaque was to record the visit to St. John's, when the town was called Gisselton, and where readers will recall from an earlier chapter Lady Mountbatten had died. And at the time when I escorted her body back to Borneo, the Chief of Air Staff, then Marshal of the R.A.A.F. Sir John Grantley, requested that a senior officer from the headquarters go to Borneo and present the plaque. I told Sir Rochford Hughes of my association with Countess Mountbatten's death, and he straight away said that he thought I would be the most appropriate officer to do the presentation. He sent a signal to the CAS accordingly, who replied that he thought that I would be eminently suitable, to use his words. Subsequently, it was arranged that I would be flown over to Borneo in an Andover on a training flight. Subsequently, on the 9th of July, the arrangements having been made with the Malaysia authorities in Kota Kinabalu, I flew over for the presentation. The commissioner of the local association was an English doctor, Richard Dingley, who, with his wife, met me at the airport, then very kindly invited me to stay at their home. That evening we went to a local restaurant, where I met various local members of the St. John's. The next morning I was taken on a tour of the city and local places of interest. Kota Kinabalu had been occupied by the Japanese during the war, who had carried on just as cruelly as they had everywhere. One building I was shown had been a place of interrogation with all that its brutalities, and which the local Borneo people were still scared to go near. On a more pleasant note, that evening the local contingent of the St. John Ambulance Brigade were assembled outside their headquarters, where I was introduced to the commissioner, who referred to my link with Countess Mountbatten's death. I made a speech and presented the plaque, where I then spoke to a number of the young Malaysians on the parade. It was a most memorable occasion at which the local press were present and took photographs. Copies of these were sent to me later on in Singapore and then to Lord Mountbatten. The next morning the Andover and crew flew down to a couple of airstrips on the Borneo coast and then on to Labuan, where we had lunch. In the afternoon we flew back to Singapore. The final part of this historic event in my life was to receive a personal letter of thanks from Lord Mountbatten on behalf of the Mountbatten family. It is a treasured possession displayed in my home today. Many years later I, like so many thousands, was to hear the tragic and devastating news of his assassination by the IRA in Ireland. I had always had the highest admiration for this great man. Another momentous event in 1968 was the announcement by the British government that British Defence Forces were to withdraw completely from Singapore over the next 3 years. This news came as a blow to us all, and would sever a link with the British forces over a couple of centuries with the colony. It was a hard knock to the Singapore government because of the wide and adverse effect it would have on the island. Some 45,000 servicemen and their families served on the island, bringing work directly and indirectly to the whole area, so the economic effects would also be widespread. Characteristically, Lee Kuan Yew grasped the nettle and started to plan for the withdrawal. Talks began with the Singapore government ministers on handling over of all the facilities and equipment etc. which would become available to them over the next 3-year period. I became involved in these meetings in my capacity as part of the Air Commander's staff. Amongst the Australians and New Zealanders and their governments there was feeling of being let down and deserted by the British government. A British delegation of MPs came on a visit and were briefed by the British commanders in Singapore. Air Marshal Hughes pulled no punches when he addressed them. I was present when he told them that every New Zealand town and village had memorials to the Kiwis who fought for Britain and Europe in 2 world wars. This was not very well received by some of the British MPs, and I understand, when they reported back to the government in London. It had repercussions for Sir Rochford through the Chief of Defence Staff and the R.A.A.F. The Singapore government were invited to send a delegation to tour all of the defence establishments and facilities in Singapore which would eventually become theirs. The delegation was headed by the Prime Minister, and a luncheon was arranged at the headquarters mess, after the briefing given to them and prior to their tour of the bases. I was introduced to Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and he showed considerable interest when I told him I had been stationed at Changi when he first became Prime Minister. I shall never forget the main question he put to me. What changes, he asked, did I notice since my tour in 1959 to 1961? I mentioned the huge numbers of new buildings and the various other constructions. I don't mean the buildings, he said. What about the people? I told him that I saw the significant change in their confidence and that they seemed assured of their future. That's what I wanted to know, he told me. To my mind, this conversation summed up all his greatness and showed that to him, people were more important than material things. It was a privilege and an honor to meet this outstanding leader, and it is a pity there aren't more like him around today. After their tour of the bases, the Singapore delegation expressed considerable concern at the vastness of what would be handed over to them. They were perplexed as to what on earth they would do with it all. In the event they have coped remarkably well. As far as Air Marshal Hughes was concerned, this meeting with Lee Kuan Yew began a relationship of considerable importance, because on completion of his tour with FEAF, Sir Rochford left the R.A.A.F. and became air advisor to the Singapore PM for several years, playing a significant part in the build-up of the Singapore Air Force to its present higher level of confidence and effectiveness. Time was now passing quickly towards the end of my tour of Singapore and the R.A.A.F. I had to sort out what I was going to do when I got to New Zealand. I was only 46 years of age and had to make a new life and a career in my new country. One day I was talking to another staff officer, squadron leader Colin Lovegrove, a New Zealander who was also leaving the R.A.A.F. to return to Auckland. I questioned him on opportunities on aviation in New Zealand, and he told me that he had already got a job to go to as a flying instructor with the Auckland Aero Club. Colin told me that a former R.A.F chap who was CFI at the club had offered him the job. When I asked who this was, he told me it was Lou Day, whom I had known at Kinloss. It was Lou and his wife Doreen, who had shared a flat with Gladys and I in Forest when she first came to UK. I wrote to Lou and he replied almost at once, offering me a job as a flying instructor with the Auckland Aero Club. I grabbed the opportunity, which was a great weight off my mind. At least I had a job to go to, and more especially a flying post. My instructing at Singapore Flying Club took on a new purpose. I also received some help for my future flying career before I left Singapore. The air commander arranged for me to get some flying in the Meteor aircraft and renew my jet instrument rating just before I departed. The time came to pack up and leave and say our farewells to our friends and to the R.A.A.F. One worry we had was our pet dog Toby, who we had taken over from a family going home soon after we got settled in Singapore. Toby was a real tough diamond, a fighter and a terrible chaser of lady dogs. Usually the pursuit of the latter led to the former. He would disappear for a day or so, and then come back battered, cut and bruised after chancing his luck with the kampong dogs. He was well known around Changi for he would follow us to the officers' mess and club and end up getting there before we did, by taking shortcuts. People would say we knew you were coming because Toby is already here. Fortunately, we found a medical officer who wanted a dog as a pet and he gave Toby a good home. I always remember Toby when our cat died from an attack from a snake. Toby finished the snake off after the attack. He would take on anyone or anything, especially the local postman, who one unfortunate official knew to his cost. He described Toby as a lousy nuisance. The last days of my time in the R.A.A.F. were tinged with a sense of nostalgia and sadness at ending my 29 years of service. Doubts remained as to whether I should have served on until I was 55 years of age. I was dined out in the mess at a formal guest night, where the Chief of Staff made a complimentary speech on my career, to which I replied in appropriate manner. There were many other parties, both private and otherwise, all adding to the sadness at departing service life. One makes so many friendships over a long career, that when you leave, it's like saying farewell to one's family. Finally, one begins to look forward to getting on one's way and try to be optimistic over the future. In late October we flew out of Singapore to Auckland. Gladys flew by civil airliner and I was flown down, with my kit in an R.A.A.F. Hercules by the CEO of Changi himself to RNZAF Wainuipe in Auckland. So ended my R.A.A.F. career. Fortunately, it had ended with an eventful 2 years and did not grind down slowly in a dreary job somewhere in UK. I faced the future with some misgivings, as, no doubt, all people leaving the services do. As one person described it so aptly, it gets awful drafty as you get near the door. On reviewing my career in the R.A.A.F. I suppose I could be well satisfied. When I started out in life my expectations had been somewhat limited, never having expected to reach the level that eventually I had achieved. In my wildest dreams I would never have thought that I would reach the rank of wing commander and be decorated 3 times. In addition, I had been to so many parts of the world and had so many adventures. Many of the places I had been to and the job I had done were, even in a service career, quite unique. If one is ambitious, one always feels that one could have done better, but that can really be no more than speculation. Sometimes I feel that I made a big mistake in deciding to leave the R.A.A.F. whilst I was in Gibraltar, when my future had looked so good for further promotion. However, one can only do what one thinks best at the time. Life was far from over and in many ways my future in civilian life was to bring many more adventures, again beyond my realization in 1968.